David Clark sat in the high-backed leather chair, his hands clasped loosely in his lap as he watched the slide transition on the massive boardroom screen. The glow from the projector cast sharp, clinical shadows across the faces of the 12 senior executives gathered around the mahogany table. On the screen, a slide that had taken David 3 weeks of meticulous calculations to prepare was now displayed, but it was defaced with thick, digital red circles and warning exclamation points. Standing at the front of the room was Rachel, his colleague of 2 years. She wore a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit, her posture radiating a practiced, executive authority. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a tone of grave professional concern that David knew she had spent years refining. As you can clearly observe in these comparative projections, Rachel said, gesturing toward the highlighted sections of the graph, the model David has proposed deviates significantly from standard financial forecasting principles. When we plot his data against traditional industry baselines, the discrepancies are not just noticeable, they are alarming. David did not move. He kept his face carefully neutral, his breathing slow and measured, even as a familiar tightness gripped his chest. Beside him, Director Richard Bennett, a man of 55 who had spent 3 decades navigating corporate hierarchies, removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "And you are certain about these discrepancies, Rachel?" Richard asked, his voice heavy with the fatigue of a long meeting. "Absolutely, Richard," Rachel replied, turning to face the director with a reassuring smile. "I have personally reconstructed the dataset using our firm's standard mathematical templates. The variance is substantial. If we were to present these numbers to our primary client, Oak Ridge Wealth Management, next week, we would be exposing Summit Advisory Group to immense reputational risk." She clicked the remote, advancing the presentation to another slide. This one showed a complex risk assessment model David had designed. "Most concerning is this specific risk matrix," Rachel continued, her tone growing more urgent. "It employs a nonlinear mathematical methodology that, while creative, is completely unaligned with established economic forecasting standards. If this model had been applied retroactively to the market corrections of last February, it would have missed the downturn entirely, potentially costing our clients millions of dollars." A quiet murmur rippled through the executives. David could see the subtle shifts in their body language, the crossing of arms, the subtle nods of agreement. They were already moving toward a consensus. The promotion David had spent the last 4 years working toward, the senior director position that would finally give him the authority to implement his analytical models, was dissolving before his eyes. David was 48 years old. He had spent his entire career building a reputation as a quiet, brilliant quantitative analyst who let his work speak for itself. He was not a man for corporate politics, nor did he enjoy the self-aggrandizing presentations that seemed to carry so many of his peers to the upper echelons of the firm. He was the middle child of 3, raised in a household where the loudest voices always commanded attention, leaving him to observe, listen, and speak only when he was certain of his facts. At Summit Advisory Group, David had spent 12 years working late into the evening, refining models that consistently outperformed the market. His clients respected him, even if the executives rarely noticed him. He had watched his mother, a brilliant software engineer, spend decades at a technology firm, being consistently bypassed for promotions by louder, less competent colleagues because she refused to engage in office politics. He had promised himself he would succeed on the strength of his mind alone, but watching Rachel dismantle his work, he realized how naive that promise had been. Rachel had joined Summit 2 years ago, bringing with her a reputation for aggressive networking and an uncanny ability to align herself with the shifting winds of executive favor. While David spent his weekends testing algorithms, Rachel spent hers playing golf with board members or attending charity galas. She was loud, charismatic, and determined to climb the corporate ladder at any cost. When the Oak Ridge Wealth Management account, worth $3 million in annual management fees, came up for its quarterly review, Richard Bennett announced that the analyst who led the account successfully would receive the vacant senior director's seat. David had poured his soul into the project, creating a custom forecasting model tailored specifically to the unique volatility patterns Oak Ridge had been experiencing. He had shared his progress with Rachel, believing they were colleagues working toward a common goal. She had asked detailed questions, admired his methodology, and volunteered to handle the client communication so David could focus entirely on the quantitative analysis. Now, David understood the depth of her strategy. She had not been helping him. She had been gathering ammunition. She had spent the last 3 weeks meeting privately with Richard's assistant, planting seeds of doubt about David's stability and the safety of his models, preparing for this exact boardroom ambush. "Do you have anything to say in response to this, David?" Richard asked, his eyes turning to David from across the table. The room fell silent. Every executive turned to look at the quiet analyst who had sat through the hour-long presentation without uttering a single word. David leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the mahogany table. He met Rachel's triumphant gaze with a calm, unblinking look. "Just one question for Rachel," David said, his voice quiet but perfectly clear. "Can you explain why the client specifically requested this non-linear approach in their initial project brief?" Rachel's confident smile flickered, a subtle tightening at the corners of her mouth that only someone who had studied her for 2 years would notice. She quickly recovered, smoothing her posture. "The client expects industry-standard forecasting," Rachel replied, her tone dripping with condescending patience. "They hired us for our professional expertise, not to experiment with unproven mathematical theories." David did not argue. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick, bound document printed on heavy paper. He slid it across the polished table, allowing it to rest directly in front of Richard Bennett. "This is the official project brief delivered to us by Oak Ridge Wealth Management 3 months ago," David said, his voice remaining level and calm. "If you turn to page 17, you will find the specific requirements outlined by their Chief Investment Officer, Dr. Harold Jenkins. Page 17 states that Oak Ridge requires nonlinear volatility tracking to capture the exact market anomalies that traditional models consistently miss." Richard Bennett frowned, picking up the document and flipping through the pages. The other executives leaned closer, their attention shifting from Rachel to the paper in the director's hands. "Dr. Jenkins and his quantitative team have spent the last 2 years researching these specific patterns," David continued. "They came to Summit Advisory Group because our standard models, the very ones Rachel has spent the last hour praising, failed to predict the market correction last February, costing their fund over $12 million. They explicitly stated in the brief that any proposal relying solely on standard linear models would be rejected immediately." A heavy silence fell over the boardroom. Richard Bennett stopped flipping pages, his gaze locking onto the text of page 17. His face slowly hardened. "Is this correct, Rachel?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Were you aware of this requirement?" "Richard, of course I was aware," Rachel stammered, her cheeks flushing red as she looked down at her notes. "But David's implementation is highly unstable. I believed it was my responsibility to protect the firm by offering a more secure, standardized alternative. We cannot risk our relationship with Oak Ridge on experimental algorithms." "The algorithms are not experimental," David replied, turning his eyes to the screen. "They have been back-tested against 10 years of historical data. In our simulations, this model successfully identified 84% of major market movements compared to only 61% identified by the traditional models Rachel is proposing. Dr. Jenkins himself reviewed the preliminary data 2 weeks ago and expressed his enthusiasm. I have been in weekly strategy meetings with their research team, which I assumed was being communicated to leadership." Richard Bennett closed the document with a sharp thud. He looked at Rachel, then at David, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "It seems we have a major communication breakdown," Richard said, his voice tight. "We will pause this meeting. The executive committee needs to review this brief and the correspondence with Oak Ridge." "Rachel, David, thank you. You are dismissed." As they stepped out of the boardroom into the quiet, carpeted hallway, Rachel grabbed David's arm, pulling him into an empty conference room. Her professional facade had vanished, replaced by a raw, burning anger. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her eyes wide. "You set me up. You stood there and let me present for an hour just to humiliate me in front of the board." David gently but firmly removed her hand from his sleeve. "I did not set you up, Rachel. I simply assumed that as the person who volunteered to handle client communications, you had actually read the client brief. Or did you think you could copy my models, simplify them into something you understood, and present them as your own work without anyone noticing?" Rachel laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You think you've won? Richard Bennett has known me for 2 years. He knows my value to this firm. He knows you're just a quiet numbers guy who can't speak to clients. The board will never let someone like you lead our largest account. Your little stunt today just proved you're not a team player. We will see what the client thinks," David said quietly, before walking away, leaving her alone in the room. That evening, David sat in his quiet apartment staring out at the city lights. His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was a brief email from Richard Bennett. "Meeting tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Dr. Harold Jenkins and the Oak Ridge team will be present. Be prepared to present your models in full." David spent the night reviewing his data, checking every formula and visualization. He knew this was his only chance to protect his work, his career, and the legacy he had built over 12 years of silent dedication. The next morning, the atmosphere in the main conference room was cold and formal. Dr. Harold Jenkins, the Chief Investment Officer of Oak Ridge Wealth Management, sat at the head of the table. Beside him were two senior portfolio managers, their faces grim. Richard Bennett sat to the right, looking visibly tense, while Rachel sat at the opposite end, her posture rigid and her expression masked in professional determination. "Thank you for meeting with us on such short notice, Harold," Richard Bennett began, offering a polite smile. "We wanted to ensure that we are completely aligned on the quantitative models for the upcoming quarter." Dr. Jenkins did not return the smile. He placed a printed document on the table, tapping his finger against it. "To be frank, Richard, we are not aligned," Dr. Jenkins said, his voice flat. "Yesterday afternoon, I received a set of standard linear projections from Rachel, claiming they represented Summit Advisory Group's final analysis for our fund. I must tell you, my team was deeply disappointed. These standard models are precisely what we told you we could not use. If this is the direction Summit is taking, we will be forced to terminate our agreement and find a partner who can meet our technical specifications." Richard Bennett's face flushed. He quickly looked toward David, then back to the client. "Harold, please accept my apologies," Richard said. "There has been an internal misunderstanding. The standard projections you received do not represent our final recommendation. David Clark, who has been leading the quantitative development for your account, has prepared the custom nonlinear models you requested." "David, please present." David stood up, walking to the podium. For the next 45 minutes, he spoke with absolute clarity, explaining the mathematical foundations of his models, the backtesting results, and how the nonlinear tracking would protect Oak Ridge's assets during periods of high volatility. He did not look at Rachel once, but he could feel her eyes burning into him from across the room. When he finished, Dr. Jenkins nodded slowly, his expression softening for the first time. "This is exactly what we were looking for, David," Dr. Jenkins said, turning to Richard. "This analysis is brilliant. The custom visualizations capture the precise volatility parameters my team needs to monitor. I want to make it clear, we are staying with Summit Advisory Group solely because of David's work. I expect him to oversee our portfolio directly from this point forward." "Of course, Harold," Richard Bennett agreed immediately. "David will be appointed as the lead director for the Oak Ridge account, effective today." Rachel's face had turned a pale, chalky white. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but Dr. Jenkins stood up, shaking David's hand. "Excellent work, David. I look forward to our weekly reviews," Dr. Jenkins said, before leading his team out of the room. Once the clients had left, Richard Bennett turned to Rachel, his voice cold and resolute. "Rachel, you will transfer all files and client contacts related to Oak Ridge to David immediately. Human Resources will be contacting you this afternoon to discuss your reassignment to Internal Administrative Analytics." "You are dismissed." Rachel stood up, packed her laptop in silence, and walked out of the room, her head held high despite the devastating defeat. It should have been a moment of triumph for David. He had secured the promotion, saved the firm's largest account, and exposed the colleague who had tried to steal his work. Yet, as he moved his belongings into the director's office, he felt no joy, only a lingering exhaustion. Within 2 weeks, the exhaustion turned to anxiety. David began to notice small, disturbing discrepancies in his daily work. A folder containing his raw dataset for the upcoming weekly report mysteriously vanished from the shared network drive. The next day, a calendar invitation for a critical review meeting with Dr. Jenkins was deleted from his calendar without his knowledge, causing him to join the call 15 minutes late. Then, the sabotage became more serious. A presentation deck David had prepared for the board was altered overnight. The formulas on slide 12 had been modified, replacing his nonlinear equations with simplified incorrect variables that made his projections look ridiculous. Fortunately, David had developed a habit of keeping offline backups on his personal drive, allowing him to restore the original slides minutes before the meeting. "You look exhausted, David," his colleague Sarah said, stopping by his desk with a cup of coffee. "Is everything all right?" David rubbed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. "Someone is altering my files, Sarah. I cannot prove it. But I have to spend 3 hours every night verifying every line of code and every slide before I send anything out." Sarah leaned in, lowering her voice. "It is Rachel. I saw her talking to Richard's assistant yesterday. They were looking at the server logs. Rachel still has friends in IT from her networking days, and she is telling anyone who will listen that your models are too complex and that you are bound to make a catastrophic error. She is waiting for you to fail, David. You need to be extremely careful." The blow came 3 days later from Dr. Jenkins himself during their weekly phone call. "David, I wanted to bring something to your attention," Dr. Jenkins said, his tone cautious. "We were recently approached by Apex Analytics, one of your main competitors. They submitted a proposal claiming they can implement our nonlinear volatility models at a lower management fee. What caught my attention was that their proposal contained mathematical structures nearly identical to the models you designed for us." David felt his stomach drop. "Identical, Dr. Jenkins?" "Yes," the client confirmed. "They claim they have recently hired a senior specialist who pioneered this specific methodology. I wanted to verify if you were still committed to Summit, or if there had been some division in your team." "I am completely committed to Summit, Dr. Jenkins," David assured him, keeping his voice steady. "I designed those models myself. May I ask who Apex hired?" "A woman named Rachel," Dr. Jenkins replied. "She contacted our portfolio managers directly. After the call, David searched the industry news portals. There it was, a press release from Apex Analytics announcing the appointment of Rachel as their new director of strategic forecasting. The release praised her groundbreaking work in nonlinear financial modeling and listed several upcoming projects that David knew were based on his proprietary algorithms. David immediately requested a meeting with Richard Bennett and the firm's head of legal affairs, a stern attorney named Thomas Cole. In the privacy of the legal office, David explained the situation, showing them the timeline of his developments and Rachel's sudden departure to Apex. "This is a clear violation of her employment agreement," David argued. "She took my proprietary code and quantitative models to our competitor. This is misappropriation of trade secrets under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, 18 United States Code Section 1836. Thomas Cole sighed, tapping a pencil against his desk. "Proving that in court is a different matter. David, do you have direct evidence that she downloaded the code to a personal device? Did our IT department find any record of data transfer?" "IT found nothing," David admitted. "She was clever. She had access to my files during our collaboration phase, and she could have easily copied the formulas manually or taken screenshots. But the models are identical. Without digital forensics showing an unauthorized transfer of proprietary files, a lawsuit could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars," Thomas Cole explained. "Furthermore, Apex will argue that these mathematical models are based on public academic papers. Unless she presents our exact proprietary code in public, we cannot easily get an injunction." David left the meeting feeling empty. The legal system was too slow, and corporate bureaucracy would allow Rachel to steal his client before Summit could file a single motion. He realized that if he wanted to protect his career, he had to stop Rachel himself. He returned to his office and began analyzing the industry calendar. In 2 weeks, the National Quantitative Finance Conference would take place at the Meridian Hotel. Rachel was scheduled as a keynote speaker, presenting a session titled Innovations in Nonlinear Volatility Forecasting. David called Sarah into his office. "Sarah, you mentioned you have a former colleague who now works in the marketing department at Apex Analytics. Is there any way they could get a draft of Rachel's presentation slides?" Sarah looked at him, concerned. "David, what are you going to do?" "I am going to ensure the truth is told," David said quietly. 2 days later, Sarah delivered a USB drive containing a draft of Rachel's presentation deck. David opened the files on his laptop. As he scrolled through the slides, his anger burned hotter. Rachel had not even bothered to rewrite the mathematical proofs. She had simply changed the background color from Summit's green to Apex's blue, keeping his exact formatting, his unique variable notation, and even a minor typographical error in the third equation that David had later corrected. David knew that if he simply complained to the conference organizers, Rachel would claim he was trying to sabotage her career. He needed to expose her in a way that left no room for denial. In front of the very audience she was trying to impress, he contacted Laura, the event manager at the Meridian Hotel, whom he had worked with on past charity events. "Laura, I am presenting a short technical segment at the conference, and I want to make sure my laptop connects properly with your display system," David said. "Would it be possible for me to test the equipment in the main hall the evening before the event?" "Of course, David," Laura replied. "The technical team will be setting up between 7 and 9 o'clock. You can drop by then." That evening, David arrived at the empty ballroom of the Meridian Hotel. While the technicians were busy setting up microphones, David connected his laptop to the presentation console. Operating in a quiet, focused state, he accessed the media server's directory. He wrote a simple command script that would monitor the slide inputs during Rachel's presentation slot. If the system detected the specific slide titles from Rachel's deck, the script would automatically execute a split-screen command, displaying her slide on the left and David's original, time-stamped Summit Advisory Group files on the right, under a bold title. Comparison of development timelines. David tested the script twice, ensuring it ran silently in the background, invisible to the technicians. When he finished, he packed his laptop and walked out into the cool night air. Ready for the final confrontation, the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel was filled to capacity. Over 300 quantitative analysts, investment officers, and financial executives sat in neat rows under the glittering chandeliers. At the front, the massive high-definition screen displayed the title of the session: Innovations in Nonlinear Volatility Forecasting, with Rachel's name and her new title at Apex Analytics written below. David sat in the middle row, flanked by Sarah and 3 other analysts from Summit. A few rows ahead sat Dr. Harold Jenkins and his investment committee, watching the stage with keen interest. At precisely 10 o'clock, Rachel walked onto the stage. She was a master of the spotlight, commanding the room with a confident smile and a clear, resonant voice. For years, our industry has relied on linear models that fail. During periods of high volatility, Rachel began, her hands gesturing elegantly. "Today, I am proud to present a new paradigm in risk management, developed through months of rigorous mathematical testing at Apex Analytics." David watched as she progressed through the introductory slides, explaining the theory behind nonlinear analysis. She spoke with absolute authority, presenting David's years of research as if they were her own personal breakthroughs. Then, she clicked the remote to display the first core mathematical slide. On the screen, instead of her single blue Apex slide, the display split cleanly in two. On the left side was Rachel's slide, displaying the complex volatility equation. On the right side was David's original presentation slide, dated 3 months earlier, showing the identical equation down to the custom notations. Above the images, a bold header read, "Comparison of Development Timelines, Apex versus Summit." Rachel paused, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She clicked the remote again, attempting to skip the slide. The next slide appeared, but it too was split. The left showed Rachel's backtesting results, claiming 82% accuracy. The right showed David's original summit slide, showing 84% accuracy, dated 2 weeks before Rachel left the firm. A murmur went through the audience. People began whispering, leaning in to look closer at the dates displayed on the right side of the screen. "There seems to be a formatting issue with the projector," Rachel said, her voice rising slightly as she looked toward the technical booth. "If we could please reset the presentation." She clicked the remote rapidly, trying to force the system to advance, but the script David had written was locked into the server. Every slide she displayed was paired with its corresponding original from Summit Advisory Group, clearly showing that every formula, graph, and data point had been created by David months before she joined Apex. Dr. Harold Jenkins stood up from his seat, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd. "Rachel, can you explain why the slides you are presenting as new developments from Apex are identical to the models David Clark designed for my firm 3 months ago?" Dr. Jenkins asked, his expression stern. Even the variable notations and the mathematical proof structure matched the proprietary reports we received at Oak Ridge. Rachel's face drained of color. She looked desperately toward the wings of the stage, but the technicians were frantically typing at their consoles, unable to override the script without shutting down the entire system. "Dr. Jenkins, this is proprietary Apex research," Rachel said, her voice shaking. We developed these models independently. Any similarity is purely coincidental." "Coincidental?" Brian, a senior analyst from another major firm, called out. "You even have the same typographical error in the third equation, the letter X replaced by a Y in the denominator, which was a known typo in David's early drafts. How do you explain that?" David stood up slowly, drawing the attention of the room. "She cannot explain it, Brian," David said, his voice calm and carrying clearly across the ballroom, "because these models are the intellectual property of Summit Advisory Group. Rachel had access to them during our collaboration on the Oak Ridge account. After realizing she could not reproduce them herself, she copied them, resigned from Summit, and joined Apex to solicit our clients. You hacked this presentation!" Rachel screamed, pointing a trembling finger at David, her carefully cultivated composure completely shattering in front of the entire industry. "The presentation simply shows the truth," David replied. "Under the Defend Trade Secrets Act, 18 United States Code Section 1836, quantitative models developed using company resources are trade secrets. By taking this intellectual property to a competitor to solicit our clients, you have committed a federal violation and a direct breach of your fiduciary duty to Summit Advisory Group." The room erupted into loud conversations. Several executives from Apex Analytics, who were sitting in the front row, stood up and immediately walked out of the ballroom, their faces red with embarrassment. Dr. Jenkins shook his head, turning his back on the stage. Rachel stood frozen at the podium, staring at the split-screen display that had systematically exposed her deception to the entire quantitative finance community. 3 days later, Apex Analytics issued a public statement announcing that Rachel's employment had been terminated, effective immediately, citing a violation of their code of conduct. Summit Advisory Group's legal team, armed with the video footage and client testimonies from the conference, reached a private settlement with Apex that protected all of Summit's proprietary models. At Summit, the board of directors appointed David as the new chief methodology officer, giving him full authority over the firm's quantitative research and a salary that allowed him to pay off his student loans in a single payment. Sitting in his new, spacious office overlooking the city, David looked at the clean glass trophy on his desk. He had not won through loud self-promotion or corporate manipulation. He had won by letting the data and the truth speak for itself. If you enjoyed this story of workplace justice, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever had a colleague try to steal credit for your hard work? Share your story in the comments below. We would love to hear how you handled it. And if you want more stories of quiet professionals getting their sweet revenge, hit that notification bell so you never miss a video.